Okay, let's talk a bit more about behavior. So we see that behavior can have a genetic component, but can also have an environmental component. And here's a study of some mice that demonstrate this. So the California mice are naturally more aggressive than the white-footed mice, and the California mice have more parental care than the white-footed mice. So they did these reciprocal transplants in which they took some young California mice and put them with white-footed and vice versa here. What they found was the California mice reared by the white-footed mice tended to have reduced aggression compared to your typical California mouse. No difference in a neutral situation. And they had reduced paternal behavior. That is, the dads didn't care for their young nearly as much as they would normally. And with the white-footed mouse, again, the white-footed mouse is the one that tends to naturally be less aggressive, but when it's reared by a California mouse, it doesn't become more aggressive. However, it does become more aggressive in a neutral situation, but it exhibits the same kind of parental care, paternal behavior. So in this case, it seems that the California mouse is influenced a bit more by being reared by the other. So its behavior, although having a genetic component, can again be influenced by the conditions in which it's being reared. Another example in which there can be some variation in behavior, these black-capped birds that live, let me go to the map, that live in Central Europe and Germany, typically migrate to the southwest towards Spain. But there were some that showed up in Great Britain, and so what these folks in England did was they studied these birds, and they did a little interesting experiment in which they put them in these funnels, which have a top out of which they can see but they can't escape, and they find out which way they want to go by how many marks they make in a particular part of the funnel. And so what they did was the ones that were going to Britain, some of these were raised in the lab, and after even several generations, the ones raised in the lab tend to exhibit the same kinds of behavior as their parents. So even when you took them to Germany, these ones that were from Britain and raised in the lab, they did not act like the resident birds, the resident German black-capped birds who tended to go to the southwest. They headed towards the due west. So they were the same species, but they had become wired to migrate in a different way, and so they think it's a subgroup of these German ones that basically headed west instead of the southwest, and so they had a different genetic makeup. Feeding is a significant behavior, finding food, and so prey selection can be a behavior that varies and can be under evolution, natural selection, and can vary within a population. These garter snakes tend to eat these banana slugs, and it's a learned behavior they have that they just feed on these guys. And so again, natural selection can explain a lot of the behaviors we see. So if they indeed have a genetic basis, then selection can operate upon them. Again, any trait that's in your genes, natural selection can work on it. So here's some study of these Drosophila, and so what they did with these is they have these Drosophila, these fruit flies, that are raised in low and high density populations. And what they see is that the ones raised in low density population, what we're seeing here, average path length. So these are the larvae, and the larvae feed typically on fruits, but you can feed them on an artificial media. And you can see how far they travel, and so in the low density populations they tend not to travel so far because there's not much competition, not many individuals around to compete against. But in the high density population, they have to travel further on average to get the food. So an example of a behavior modified by density that has to do with feeding. And foraging behavior as well. So another example here, so what's described as optimal foraging theory. And so this is the notion that organisms will, as the name describes, forage in an optimal way, in a way that with the least effort they can get the most nutritious food. And so what this graph shows us is that as an organism travels to some new patch where there's food, at first they're gaining a lot from that food because there's a lot present, but that as they consume it, what they're gaining tends to drop off because there's less of it in the patch, and it becomes harder to find it and all that. And so what an organism is attempting to do is essentially maximize the amount of energy they get relative to the time it takes to find something, S, and the handling time, the time it takes to make, process, and consume that food. And so you want to basically increase this number, this fraction, the upper part here, the energy you get relative to the time it takes. And so this has been studied in these crows, and what they do is they take these whelks, these marine animals, these aquatic animals that have a shell, and they fly up and they drop them to try to get the shell to crack open so that they can eat what's inside. And so what you see is they've studied these birds, and so the bird can fly relatively high, and that requires only dropping the whelks a couple times to get them to crack. But again, they have to fly very high up, which is going to take more energy. Whereas they can not fly as high, but drop it more times, and so what they see is that the birds, or they can drop it a large number of times, but it takes a lot more flights to do that. So what you see is there's sort of this optimal number of drops and total flight height. And so here they're able to maximize the energy they get relative to the effort they put in, as opposed to having to fly really high or having to fly really often to drop them. Okay, now on the other side, if you're going to be eaten by something, then that is a significant risk and your behavior will be modified. So these deer, they tend to hang out more in the open because they can see better and there's less risk of predation, whereas you can see predation risk is quite high on the edge of the forest, so they tend to spend less time there. So they modify their behavior depending on the risk of predation. So we talked about in my ecology class this study where in Yellowstone the wolves were removed in the 1930s. Since then the elk and deer populations have really grown because of the lack of predators. So what they found is in the 1970s, wolves were reintroduced, and the elk and deer populations come down, and in particular the behavior changed a lot. Before, when the wolves went around, the elk would just linger around the streams, feeding on the vegetation along the streams and getting a drink. Well, when the wolves showed up, that became a very risky place to hang out, because as any predator knows, their prey will go where there's a source of water, and so the elk and deer tended to spend less time along the rivers and ponds and stuff. So they modified their behavior based on the risk of predation. Okay, fascinating area, mating systems and mate choice. So mating is a significant behavior because that's how you're going to reproduce and pass on your genes. And so there's a lot of permutations in mating systems and mate choice. You have some that are promiscuous and some that are not. So here, a monogamous relationship, one male, one female. You see that in people to a certain extent, and other species as well. Birds, certain types of birds will mate for life. But you also see some polygamous systems, in particular polygyny is with one male and many females. In these elk, for example, you tend to see males with a harem of females. Under these situations, males tend to be either more showy or larger. We'll talk about why that is in a minute. Somewhat more unusual situation is polyandry or polyandrous systems in which you have one female mating with many males. These birds exhibit this, and in this case the female is the more showy one. And the way their system works is she mates with one male, lays a bunch of eggs in the nest, she splits and he raises them. She goes and mates with another male, lays some eggs, splits, and he raises them. And then towards the end of this mating season, she will then mate with the last male and tend to stay around that one, but she's able to maximize her reproductive output by having the males take care of the offspring, and she can go on and lay another batch of eggs as opposed to having to stick around and feed all those little ones. It's a little surprising why more birds don't do that, but I guess what would be the trade-off there? If she leaves, you only have one adult feeding them as opposed to two, and so perhaps that works for them, but not most other bird species. It helps to have both adults there feeding the young. And so this leads us to parental care. So parental care is an important thing for certain species. Some species have no care of their young, but others do. And so assurance of paternity is an important thing for males. They want to make sure that the female is having their young, and so if there's greater certainty of paternity, a male is much more likely to help out with the young. And so they talk about for fish example, who have external fertilization, if the male knows that he has fertilized those eggs, and if that's the way the system works in that species, they tend to have more parental care. And so here's this male who is carrying around eggs that have been fertilized by him, and so he is in part carrying these eggs to make sure that they were the ones he's fertilized and they aren't fertilized by anyone else, and so he will care for them early on. So this leads us to sexual selection, mate choice. So the choice of a mate is important, and there's a couple ways it can happen. And so with intersexual selection, this is where basically one sex is choosing the other, and it's typically females choosing males. With intrasexual selection, this is where one of the genders is competing for access to the others, and it's typically competition between males. Okay, so in intersexual selection, mate choice by females, what's typically happened is the females are choosing the males that appear to have the best traits, and they tend to be rather ornate and showy. And so in many birds, the male tends to be a little more showy than the female, and so it's thought that there's female choice for the males that exhibit the most traits that are synonymous with having good genes and therefore having good offspring. And so there are these folks who have done these experiments, and they've exaggerated the ornamentation of males. And so here's what the normal zebra finches look like. But what they do is they add these extra ornaments to them. And so these guys over here are raising these youngs, and what happens is the females learn to associate this ornamentation with males that are most desirable and most fit. Whereas under the control group, that's the normal situation, those females do not necessarily identify that trait with being better. So here we have selection for females who identify certain extravagant traits with being those individuals that are most desirable. We see this, there's many examples of this in the animal kingdom, and we see some of these really exaggerated traits, like these insects here, that the males have these eye stalks that are really long and almost seem unnecessary, but that characteristic has become synonymous with being really fit males, and so the females tend to choose them. So it's thought that this sort of drives this extreme phenotype, this female choice. All right, now intrasexual selection, and I'm just about out of time, so I'm going to have to stop here.